Today's lesson is, do you remember the Zeigarnik effect? Hi, everybody. I'm Roger.
Hello, I'm Kiki.
And today we're going to talk about something called the Zeigarnik effect, which is a term used in psychology. It's all about remembering things or forgetting things. So our title, of course, is very clever here. Do you remember the Zeigarnik effect, or are you going to forget all about it?
The Zeigarnik effect has to do with our ability to memorize things. And I have ADHD, so a lot of times I would remember something, but almost immediately I would forget. So when it comes to learning something new, sometimes it takes me longer to learn, for example, vocabularies or even math problems and math formulas. So I want to know more about this Zeigarnik effect and how it might help me become a better learner.
Of course, our dear students out there probably need to be taking exams all the time, and they're always looking for a new way to memorize the content. And that's what we're going to be talking about today in terms of the Zeigarnik effect. So let's find out what this is all about. Let's listen to the first part, and we'll be right back to break it down for you.
Do you remember the Zeigarnik effect? Have you ever been busy with homework only to find yourself distracted by thoughts of an exciting TV show you haven't finished watching, or some chore you've left uncompleted? If so, then a psychological phenomenon known as the Zeigarnik effect might be to blame.
大家好，第一部分我们来介绍名词 chore， 它的意思是日常杂物、琐事，也可以是乏味的苦差事的意思。例如 Johnny's mother wouldn't let him go out to play until he finished his chores. Johnny 的妈妈等到他做完家里杂物，才准他出去玩。又或者说 Melanie helps with chores after school. Melanie 放学后帮忙做家事。接下来我们看到形容词 psychological， 意思是心理或是心理学的。例如 The war veteran suffered from psychological damage because of what he had witnessed. 这名战争老兵因其所目睹的事而饱受心理创伤之苦。或是 Doris suffered no psychological harm from the tragic event. Doris 并没有在那次悲剧事件中受到任何心理上的伤害。另外，关于心理学的职业，我们补充一个单字 psychologist， P-S-Y-C-H-O-L-O-G-I-S-T psychologist 这个字为名词，它有心理学家或是心理咨询师的意思。例如 Victor is a psychologist who is researching human emotions. Victor 是个研究人类情感的心理学家。又或者Dana wants to see a psychologist about the stress she has been feeling lately. Dana 想要去找心理咨询师，讨论最近一直感到的压力。
And we're back, so we're going to start with this first part. Have you ever been busy with homework only to find yourself distracted by thoughts of an exciting TV show you haven't finished watching or some chore you've left uncompleted? That happens to me a lot. I get distracted a lot by all my different thoughts. So what is distracted? Distracted, or to have a distraction, is to be occupied by something else. You might be focusing on your homework, but suddenly you remember, oh, I left my sandwich outside. I'm going to go eat my sandwich. And when I go eat my sandwich, I decided to turn on the TV because I saw something interesting. So distractions are all around us, just like our iPads and our iPhones and things like that. And when sometimes these distractions, when they occur, it doesn't help us too much when we're trying to study for exams or do our homework.
Right, so maybe you're trying to study in the library, but you're distracted by the presence of a pretty girl that just walked in. You just can't focus on your studies, so you get distracted, and then you realize, oh, I should be focusing on my homework and not looking at pretty girls. So in this particular case, you might find yourself distracted by other things. For example, an exciting TV show you haven't finished watching, or some chore you left uncompleted. So notice our examples here. feature things that have not been finished yet. Of course, we can watch TV shows on our devices all the time, and if we get distracted by something, if we have something else to do, we don't finish watching an episode of our favorite TV show. So maybe you're thinking, oh, gee, I got to watch the rest of that. What happened to the hero in that story? I'd like to know. I really need to know. And also, you might be distracted because you left some kind of chore uncompleted. You didn't finish a chore that you were supposed to do. A chore is just something you need to do in your daily life. Most commonly, we talk about household chores, like sweeping the floor, mopping the floor, doing the dishes, dusting the furniture, and things like that. Those are some chores. Or where I grew up, of course, it was in the country, and I knew lots of farm boys who had lots of chores to do on the farm. They needed to clean the pigs, they needed to feed them, they needed to wash out the chicken coop and stuff like that. They had a lot of chores to do.
And sometimes when we want to describe something we don't like to do, we can also say that I don't want to do the dishes because it's such a chore. It makes me really unhappy to do this, or I find it very boring, and sometimes it could be very tedious. So you can say something is such a chore to do.
Right. So, for example, I was working on the yard recently. There's a lot of stuff to pick up, and I couldn't finish it. So I had to go off and go to work and things like that. But it's still in my mind. It's a chore that I left uncompleted. I haven't finished raking the yard, and I need to find time to do that. So yes, has these things or have these things ever happened to you? If so, then a psychological phenomenon known as the Zeigarnik effect might be to blame. So if these things have happened to you, you might be suffering, or you might have this happening to you, a psychological phenomenon known as the Zeigarnik effect that might be responsible or that might be to blame. So if something's psychological, it has to do with your mind.
And to study something psychological, it is the study of psychology. And when somebody studies your mind, they are a psychologist. And usually when you're having trouble sleeping, if you have insomnia, you could also go and see a psychologist to find out why you're having trouble sleeping. Is something bothering you that you're not able to rest?
Okay, and for example, I have a friend, her name is Gloria, and she says she is allergic to oranges, but I don't believe her. I think it's just something psychological. It's just in her head. She's not really allergic to oranges. She just made that up. So yes, indeed, we have this psychological phenomenon, which is known as the Zeigarnik effect, and that might be to blame. To be to blame just means that's the cause of something. I could say, for example, oh, I haven't been getting much sleep lately. I think staying up and watching TV is to blame. That's the reason why I haven't been getting enough sleep lately. Okay, that brings us to the end of the first part of our lesson today. Let's move on now to the second part and talk some more about the Zeigarnik effect.
The Zeigarnik effect describes our tendency to remember partially finished tasks better than finished ones. It was discovered by the psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik when she was dining with some colleagues. She observed that their waiter could remember their orders quite well while the orders were still unpaid. However, he had trouble remembering them once they'd been paid for.
第二部分我们看到名词 tendency 这个字有倾向或是经常性的行为以及趋势的意思。例如Tony has a tendency to talk about how much money he makes. Tony 经常谈论自己赚多少钱。或者 There has been a growing tendency among younger people to marry later or not at all. 年轻人晚婚或甚至是不结婚的趋势正在成长。另外，我们也可以用 have a tendency toward 或是 towards 加名词或动词 ing 来表示经常……例如 Charlie has a tendency towards books as his friends' birthday gifts.Charlie 常把书作为给朋友的生日礼物。或是 Jake has a tendency towards binge eating when he feels stressful. Jake 感到压力时就会有暴饮暴食的倾向。再来介绍副词 partially， 它的意思是部分的或是在某种程度上。例如 According to the police investigation, the driver is only partially responsible for the accident. 根据警方调查，驾驶只需要为这起意外负部分责任。或是What Logan said is only partially true. Logan 说的话只有部分是真的。
Okay, let's talk about part 2 of what the Zeigarnik effect is. So the Zeigarnik effect describes our tendency to remember partially finished tasks better than finished ones. So what this means is that our brain is able to remember things that we've done only partially, though. So we tend to remember things that we've done only halfway. And that's why there are these distractions. So if we finished something, we won't really have the Zeigarnik effect because you've already completed it and our mind, it won't even bother with it. But when we finish something partially, I only remember, oh, I haven't finished my homework, so now I gotta go do that instead of doing the dishes. I'm getting distracted by all these different thoughts.
Exactly. So again, partially just means to a certain extent, not 100%. And yes, indeed, we're more likely to remember partially finished tasks than the finished ones. We have this tendency. A tendency is just a likelihood that something's going to happen. For example, my friend Louisa has a tendency to stay out late at night, even though she knows she should go home early, get to sleep, and get up early the next morning to go to work. But she has this tendency to want to stay up late and go out with her friends and things like that. So yes, we do have this tendency. It's likely to happen to us. We remember things that we haven't finished more than the things that we have finished. And it was discovered by the psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik when she was dining with some colleagues. So this is where the term comes from. We have a psychologist, somebody who specializes in psychology, and her name was Bluma Zeigarnik, and she thought about this when she was dining with some of her colleagues or some of her coworkers.
She observed that their waiter could remember their orders quite well while the orders were still unpaid. However, he had trouble remembering them once they'd been paid for. So here we can see that a task was partially done because the order wasn't paid yet. So their meal, they didn't pay for their meal yet, and the waiter was able to remember everything that they ordered. But once they paid for the meal, he forgot. He forgot what they ordered.
Exactly. So, for example, they may have ordered things like crepe Suzette or boeuf bourguignon or chile con carne or something like that. He could remember all that kind of stuff, but later when it came to pay the bill, and after it had been paid, then they asked him, well, do you remember what we ate? And, gee, I don't remember. So that was an interesting tendency. He could remember the orders before they paid, but he could not remember them after they paid, which is a complete action. And that's what she observed when she went to a restaurant with her colleagues. And maybe some of us have had similar experiences when we try to memorize things for a test, or we try to remember the way to get from our house to a certain restaurant in another part of the city. These things can be applied to real life. I'm very sure of it. Okay, that brings us to the end of the second part of our lesson. Let's move on now to the third part. Listen carefully because it is a little long.
It seems that when we begin but don't complete a task, thoughts of it keep returning to our mind, and by constantly thinking about it, we also remember it better until it's finished. Therefore, it appears that the Zeigarnik effect may essentially be a special strategy that our short-term memory uses to better retain relevant information. The Zeigarnik effect can thus help us study better. For example, instead of cramming for an exam, take breaks between study sessions. Such interruptions will let you retain information better, at least until the exam is over.
第三部分我们来看到 retain 这个动词有记住、保留或是保存的意思。例如 The house I bought last year has retained its original value. 我去年买的房子还保有原来的价值。又或者 The TV show has retained its popularity for years. 这部电视节目多年来人气不减。最后来介绍 cram 这个动词，它有考前临时死记硬背或是将点点点塞满的意思。例如Students who only cram the night before an exam usually don't end up learning much. 那些在考试前一晚临时恶补的学生，通常最后都不会学到太多东西。或是 The traveler crammed several souvenirs in his suitcase. 那名旅客把好几项纪念品塞进手提箱里。
Let's talk about this last part of our article today. It seems that when we begin but don't complete a task, thoughts of it keep returning to our mind. And by constantly thinking about it, we also remember it better until it's finished. So does that mean that when we're studying, this Zeigarnik effect might actually be more helpful for us?
Could be indeed. So we have begun to do a task, but we haven't finished it. So, of course, we keep thinking about it. Oh, gee, I got to finish that. I didn't finish that. So, of course, all these thoughts are still in your mind, and you're constantly thinking about it. And then we will remember it better until it's finished, and then after it's finished, we'll probably forget all about it. I suppose that applies to when we take exams, for example. You've studied a lot of stuff, but you haven't actually taken the exam yet, so it's not completed. And then after you take the exam, you'll probably pretty much forget everything you learned after the exam.
Right. I'm sure that has happened to me multiple times. Therefore, it appears that the Zeigarnik effect may essentially be a special strategy that our short-term memory uses to better retain relevant information. So this Zeigarnik effect might actually be a natural phenomenon or a natural thing that occurs in our mind to help us remember things better and to retain these information better. So to retain something is to be able to keep something in our mind, or you can retain something physical as well.
Right, so it's essentially a special strategy. Basically, that's what it is. And here in the final paragraph, it begins by saying, the Zeigarnik effect can thus help us study better. So if we realize that this is happening, we can use the Zeigarnik effect to help us study better or to remember other things in life that are important. Let's give you an example here. For example, instead of cramming for an exam, take breaks between study sessions. Okay, so of course, a lot of our dear students have to take exams, and if you're preparing for an exam, you need to do some cramming. That's from the verb to cram, which means to put a lot of something in a small space, in this case, taking a lot of information and putting it into your head. So you're cramming for an exam, but don't just pull an all-nighter and keep studying all the way till 4 or 5 in the morning. Give yourself a break. Take breaks between study sessions so that your mind can kind of reflect back on what you have been studying.
Here we have the word sessions. So what a session is, they are periods of time that we're doing something. So for example, if we have a study session, we can split it into several different periods of time. So for example, let's study for 20 minutes and then we'll take a 10-minute break. We'll come back for another 20 minutes and we'll take another break. And that makes us study for 1 full hour, but without having to sit through one whole study session. So a session is to be able to split things up into different time frames.
And I can't really imagine modern students studying for 3 or 4 hours straight without taking breaks. That smartphone is just too tempting to look at every 5 to 10 minutes to see if your friend has posted something new or how many likes you got on your recent post. So yes, indeed, people will be distracted all the time, especially by their devices. But again, we're emphasizing the fact that you could break up your study sessions by taking some breaks from time to time, and such interruptions will let you retain information better, at least until the exam is over. But then after that, I suppose you should probably review your exam later on just to make sure you didn't forget those things, because we do have a tendency to do that. Oh, the exam is over. Now I don't need to remember all those complicated math formulas.
Right. And just going back to the word session, it can also be a grouping of a certain topic. For example, if we had a conversation and we wanted to talk about climate change, we would have a session of this type of discussion. So it's when a group of people come together to do a certain thing, or an event could be a session as well.
Indeed. And we do have the phrase in session, which means something is happening. So maybe you've gone to a school or something and you're making a lot of noise. Someone may remind you, oh, please, you got to be quiet. Class is in session. There's students studying right now. You're making noise would distract them, or it would be an interruption. So again, an interruption is when something gets in the way of what you're trying to do. And of course, this happens a lot of times when we're talking to somebody and somebody else starts talking. Hey, quit interrupting me. I'm trying to talk to this person. We haven't finished what we're discussing. I'll talk to you later. Don't interrupt. So in this particular case, the idea is to retain or keep that information better for the exam. And then after the exam, you'll probably forget everything. And there may be another psychological term for trying to retain that information after the exam, but we're not going to talk about that today. Right now, what we're going to do is listen to Hanny, our beloved Chinese teacher, who is very good at remembering things.
各位同学大家好，我是 Hanny。 我们来看今天的文法重点。课文第二部分提到，心理学家柴嘉尼在与几位同事用餐时注意到，当点餐还没结账时，服务生能够清楚记得他们点的餐点，然而一旦结账完成，他就想不起来这些点餐了。好，文中他用到 had trouble remembering 来表达想不起的那个意思。那我们来学习相关的用法哦，像 have trouble、have a hard time、have difficulty 或是 have problems， 这些用语后面可以接 with 加名词，或者是接动词 ing 去表达说难以做到某事，做什么有困难。那特别注意 trouble 和 difficulty 是不可数名词，固定用单数型。那我们看两个例句， Jenny is having difficulty with her homework， 就是 Jenny 在写作业时遇到困难。Jake's had trouble finding a stable job. Jake 一直难以找到稳定的工作。好，那相反的，我们可以用 have no problems, have no trouble, have no difficulty doing something 去表达说做某事没有问题，没有困难。或者是也可以用 have an easy time doing something 去表达做某事很容易，毫无困难。举例来说， We had no problems finding a parking space. 我们找停车位没有碰到困难。He had an easy time beating his opponent. 他轻轻松松就打败对方了。好，那最后也补充一下，我们刚刚有学到 have a hard time 的用法，可是如果是 give somebody a hard time， 则是指说找某人麻烦，刁难某人，让某人不好过的意思哦。好，那么课文第三部分有一句写到，柴嘉尼效应似乎在本质上也许是一种特殊策略，我们的短期记忆可以利用它更好的记住相关资讯。文中它用动词 retain 去表达记住的意思，那它也可以表达保留啊、保存的语义。我们来学它的字首字根，看到 TAIN 这个字根，它有 hold或者是 keep 的意思，就有保留啊、持有或是维持的意思。那么在 retain 这个字当中，字首 RE 表示 back 往回，字根 TAIN 它表示 hold 保留，所以合在一起它就是 hold back。那么 retain 就有保留、保有的意思咯。顺便补充两个有相同字根的单字，第一个是 pertain， 它的字首 PER 表示透过，字根 TAIN 表示 hold持有。我们可以试着以说透过某人或某种关系而持有某事物，去联想到 pertain 它有相关或是附属的意思。那么第二个补充的是 maintain， 它的字首 MAIN 表示守， TAIN 表示维持。那我们可以试着联想，用手来做这种维持保养的工作，那么 maintain 当动词就可以表达保养、维修，那它也有维持、保持的意思咯。好，以上是今天重点整理，我们来回顾今天单字吧。
Distract. Lenore couldn't focus on her textbook because she was distracted by the noise from upstairs. Chore. Doing the laundry is a chore that I always try to finish quickly. Psychological. The film explores the psychological struggles of its main character. Tendency. Kevin has a tendency to delay dealing with a difficult task. Partially. Pamela was only partially informed of the previous evening's strange events. Retain. It's important to regularly review information in order to retain it effectively. Session. I have a tutoring session scheduled for tomorrow evening.
Discussion Starter starts now!
Here's our discussion started for today. The question is, do you think you will make greater use of the Zeigarnik effect to help you study? Why or why not?
I think that's definitely a good way to help me study because I think my brain actually does that naturally on its own without knowing that it's called the Zeigarnik effect because I do tend to get distracted a lot by things that I haven't completed. So I do constantly remind myself, oh, I have to go do that thing because I'm not done yet. So I think it occurs naturally for me.
Well, me, I don't think it's going to help me at all because I think the Zeigarnik effect itself is a distraction, and I've developed my own strategies for studying things and memorizing vocabulary. I don't think I need the Zeigarnik effect, although I can see it being a useful tool for other people. Well, that brings us to the end of another edition of our program, and please make sure you join us again next time. From all of us here, I am Roger.
I am Kiki.
See you next time.